Hello, I'm Peter Cochrane, and today I want to read to you from my novel, The Making of Martin Sparrow. I've mostly written non-fiction, but for quite some time I've wanted to write a frontier novel, having been inspired by one of the great works in that genre, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, which some of you will know. It's a novel that I thought really did powerfully capture the human dimension of the intense solidarities and extremities of life on the frontier, with a pretty wonderful comic dimension too. So The Making of Martin Sparrow is inspired by that, and it's my particular go at that subgenre. Sparrow is set in the mountains west of the Hawkesbury River, and it begins in the aftermath of the Great Flood of March 1806. It's the flood that triggers a chain of events that are both terrible in consequence and also potentially redemptive for Sparrow. So what I want to do today is read chapter 1, which is a short chapter, beginning of the book, which sets the scene and also sets up the dilemma confronting Sparrow. Well, it's probably truer to say that it's the dilemma that he creates for himself. So, chapter 1. Sparrow woke on wet sand somewhere downriver with a terrible stink in his nostrils, the smell of death and decay, rotten ruin all about. At first he did not stir there in the pre-dawn. Pale light to the east beyond the river, the tide on the turn, ebbing now, the flow yet a faint murmur in his ears. Confusion held him still, as did the formidable lassitude in his bones and the damp cold on his skin. The sound of his breathing confirmed the likelihood that he was alive. He raised his head and looked about, sucked up a wad of gritty phlegm and spat on the sand. He wondered if perhaps his deliverance was the work of a kindly fate, a chance to make good his miserable existence. Hard to know. The sand was strewn with muck and wreckage. The hen coop was there, his hens dead in company with tangles of lumber and thatch, fence posts and scoured saplings, a big raggedy cut of wagged canvas, and a lidless coffin, the muddied panelling infested with yellow mould that glowed bright in the soft dawn light. He sat up and brushed himself off, noticed a long cut on the inside of his forearm, but it wasn't bad. If it was bad, deep, he might have bled to death, while he lay there in the dark, half drowned. But it wasn't, and he didn't. That was lucky. He studied the coffin, reckoned sooner or later he'd have to take a look. In all probability stare rotting death in the face. A crow alighted on the rim, shuffled one way then the other, then hopped in, keen to join its companions. Sparrow saw a flurry of black wings as the disputatious gathering settled to its work. There was a blood-soaked tear in his breeches, and a hungry leech on his thigh like a small fat velvet purse. He flicked the greedy little sucker onto the ground, took a twig and pierced it, watching his own blood spill out and colour the sand to russet. In the shallows he scooped up a fragment of the Sydney Gazette, but the newspaper dissolved in his fingers as he tried to unfold the sodden sheet. Sparrow surveyed the farms beyond the river, the flooded fields, the wildfowl feeding on the flattened corn, flood rack washing seawards on the flow. He dropped to his knees and laved water onto the little puncture wound on his thigh and the cut on his arm. Quite why he did that he did not know, for he was otherwise layered in muck all over. Memories washed about inside his head, dispelling some of the confusion. The lightning storm, the torrents of rain, the hen coop caught in the violent flow. Wheat stacks coursing the river, the unremitting fury of the waters, crops awash, the bottoms gone. The exodus of reptiles, the dismal cries from distant quarters, the sound of muskets dangerously charged. He got up and turned about, scanned the lowlands to the west. The mountains far off, full of mystery and foreboding, and full of promise too. The sound, the ebbing tide, the pecking crows. Sparrow stepped quietly from the water, stood, listened some more. He crossed the sand, took hold of the wagon sheet heavy with it wet, and edged towards the coffin until he could see the beak spearing into that shrunken face, riddled with wounds, a fledgling on the old man's chest, pecking at his coffin suit. He did not hesitate, for their pleasure had filled him with an unfamiliar wrath and rendered him vengeful. He hurled the wagon sheet across the coffin. The captive birds panicked and leapt into the cloth, and flapped and squawked and leapt again, like hearts beating in some hideous thing. Sparrow took hold of a heavy stick and began to beat the cloth with all his might. A wing appeared askew the panelling, and he smashed at it and heard the creature scream. And he kept on just so until the canvas lay sunken in the coffin and the birds were all but still, dead or dying, their frames faintly visible. He leant on the stick, sucking for breath, awaiting further movement in the coffin, watching as blood seeped into the cloth. The birds made a few pitiable sounds, now and then a ripple or a shudder or the flap of a wing. Sparrow stood over the coffin until the cloth stopped moving. He looked west to the mountains, wondering. Tiredness took hold. Maybe it's true, he said. Maybe I don't got the metal. He crossed the sand, stood over his coop, dropped to his knees. His hens in death, his good sweet giving birds, were naught but a lumpy pile of dirty feathers and claws. He reached into the coop and gently palmed his birds apart, settling his hand upon a muddied wing. Recalled the signs, the lightning storm and that inking blackness over the mountains, the discoloration of the flow and the rapid rise of the river. But the waters had receded, briefly, a most deceptive interval, that filled Sparrow with a false notion of security, and he had not then seized his opportunity. He had not got in his crop, not one ear of corn, nor had he got his scarce possessions off the floor of his hut, nor moved the coop to higher ground, thus condemning the hens to a most frightful expiration, such an end as filled Sparrow with dread, for reasons he did not care to contemplate. For all that, he was truly sorry. More than once Mortimer Craggs had told him to stop being sorry. Sorry for this, sorry for that, said Mort. You got to stop being sorry, Marty. You got to stop forthwith and seize the dream, for therein lies our path to an unfettered liberty. You follow me? Sparrow did not quite follow, but he'd said yes anyway, for he did not want further badgering from Mort, who was a fierce badgerer, and a most indiscriminately violent man once roused. Mort might well whack a man, or he might take a filleting knife and slit his nose. You never did know what Mort might do. Sparrow felt the sun on his back at last. Once more he looked west across the waterlogged lowlands to the foothills, and thence the mountains. He recalled his last conversation with Mort Craggs before Mort took off with Shug McCafferty, before they bolted for freedom. I just ain't ready to go, he'd said. He was uncertain as to why Mort had invited him to join the bolt, for they were not friends, just acquaintances, a lethal acquaintance dating back to the years of his youth in the village of Blackley, on the River Irk. I think you don't got the metal, Martin, said Mort, fingering the ridge of proud flesh on his cropped ear. I have things to say to Biddy first, said Sparrow. Forget the whore. There's women on the other side of them mountains. There's a big river, too. There's a village. Women aplenty, copper-coloured beauties, the diligence of their affection, something to behold. How do you know that? Can't say, not till you commit to the venture. Swear a binding oath. I cannot swear an oath, binding or otherwise. Not yet, said Sparrow. The very idea of copper-coloured women on the other side of the mountains puzzled Sparrow deeply. He was somewhat lost for a perspective on this startling information. Like the old Tahitians, he said. No, nothing like them, and I can say no more, Marty. Not another word. And that was the last conversation he'd had with Mort Craggs. Sparrow had to wonder if perhaps his yearning for Biddy Hap was a foolish dream. If it was not a foolish dream before the flood, it most likely was now. His 30-acre patch was swamped, his corn crib gone, his corn crop flat in the mud, the wildfowl, the boars and the mould most likely hard at work this very day. His hut might well be gone too, lost to the flood. His hens were dead. He was deep in hock, mostly to Alister Mackie, and would have to beg for seed for another crop, and that meant more hock, regardless of the weather to come. In short, it was now most unlikely that Biddy would see any chance of elevating her prospects by joining with him, Martin Sparrow, former felon, time-expired convict, failed farmer on the flood-prone bottoms of the Hawkesbury River. Fool of a man. He sat on the sand, bound his head, and ran his fingers down his forehead, over the faint indentations that continued onto his eyelids and cheeks, the all but faded scars that folk took to be the remnants of the smallpox, which they were not. He tried to sort his pictorial thoughts. That wasn't easy, with Biddy presenting herself in one instance, and the copper-coloured beauties in the next. I should have gone with Mort, he said out loud. He thought about the birthmark on Biddy's face, the mark she tried to hide with that lovely sweep of hair pinned just so. He wondered if copper-coloured women ever got birthmarks. As to that, he just did not know. The mysteries, numberless. That's the end of chapter 1. Thank you.